I stood in the shadows of the office, staring at the darkness around me. My heart felt like it was on a pendulum, swinging between anger and despair. The suitcases, the laptop, and the briefcase lay in the corridor, neatly packed and ready, as if mocking me. 8 years of marriage boiled down to those items. It didn't feel real. Not yet. Then I heard the front door creak open, followed by the sharp click of heels against the tile floor. Nora's familiar steps echoed through the silence of the house, but there was no warmth in their sound tonight. She stopped abruptly, and I knew she'd seen the luggage. I waited, knowing what was coming. Her voice cut through the air like a knife, trembling but sharp. "You're crazy," she said, her tone rising with each word. "You're leaving me and our 2 sons over one mistake?" She paused, searching my shadowed figure as though trying to find the man she thought she knew. "Because of Ryan? A stupid drunken mistake at a party?" I didn't answer. What could I say? This wasn't about one mistake, and deep down, she knew it too. But Nora wasn't ready to admit that yet. She took a step closer, her frustration evident in the clipped pace of her movements. "I didn't have an affair, Caleb. I didn't betray you," she continued, her voice climbing. "You're out of your mind if you think I did." I raised a hand to stop her. The gesture worked. She froze mid-step, her eyes narrowing as she tried to decipher me, this stranger sitting in the shadows of our shared life. I saw something flicker across her face then. Fear? No, it was confusion. She didn't understand what had changed, what had pushed me so far. But how could she? Even I struggled to put it into words. There was no singular moment, no cataclysmic event. It was years of small things, words left unsaid, touches that no longer lingered, and glances that didn't quite meet. Tonight, though, those little things had all piled up, and now they were suffocating me. "I'm sorry, Nora," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I truly am." Her face hardened at my words, the tension in her jaw betraying her frustration. "Sorry? That's all you have to say?" she snapped. "After everything? After our family, our boys, our life together? You're just sorry?" She took another hesitant step closer. This time, I didn't stop her. Part of me wanted her to reach me, to shake me out of whatever she thought this was. Maybe if she touched me, the weight of her hand would tether me to the life I was about to leave behind. But no, that wasn't going to happen. Not tonight. "I don't understand," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "Can you at least tell me why? Can you do that for me?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. I wanted to answer her, to give her the clarity she deserved. But how could I explain what even I was still unraveling? So instead, I said nothing. The silence stretched between us, oppressive and unyielding. I could see the questions racing through her mind. Was I having a breakdown? Did something happen at the party that I hadn't told her about? The truth was simpler and more devastating. I'd seen our life for what it truly was, and I couldn't unsee it. She took a step back, her movements hesitant as though she was afraid of what I might say. Or not say. I watched her carefully, noting every subtle shift in her expression. This wasn't the Nora I'd married 8 years ago. That Nora would have demanded answers, fire blazing in her eyes. This Nora, though? She looked like she was unraveling before me, unsure of her footing, unsure of us. "Caleb," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, just talk to me." For a moment, I considered it. I almost opened my mouth to spill everything I'd been holding in, to tell her about the crushing realization I'd had tonight. But I stopped myself. Words wouldn't fix this. Words had never been enough for us. So instead, I leaned back in the chair, sinking further into the shadows. "I'll explain," I said quietly. "But not yet." Her shoulders slumped at my response, and I could see the fight draining out of her. It wasn't fair, I knew that, but neither was staying in a marriage that had long since fractured under the weight of unspoken truths and unmet needs. For now, though, I let the silence speak for me. And Nora? She stood there, staring at me like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve. Neither of us moved, the space between us growing wider with each passing second. Nora's question hung in the air. Can you at least tell me why? Can you do that for me? Her voice, trembling and fragile, made me feel like a villain in my own story. I could see her searching my face for answers, for something that would make sense of the suitcases in the hallway, the shadows that cloaked me, and the man she no longer recognized. But the truth wasn't something I could simply hand her, tied up in a neat little bow. I let out a slow breath, leaning forward until my elbows rested on my knees. I had a moment of epiphany, I said finally, my voice steady but low. Her brow furrowed, confusion clouding her features. A moment of epiphany? She repeated, her tone tinged with disbelief. What does that even mean, Caleb? Why are you doing this? I leaned back into the chair, letting the shadows swallow me again. For years, I'd been the one with the explanations, the one who could articulate thoughts with clarity and precision. I taught literature, for God's sake. Words were my craft. But now, with Nora standing there, desperate for a reason, I found myself struggling to simplify what had unfolded in my mind just hours ago. I realized something. I began cautiously. Something that's been staring me in the face for years, but I've been too blind or too stubborn to see. She crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Great, she snapped. Another one of Caleb's brilliant revelations. Put it in words I can actually understand for once. I winced at the sharpness of her tone, but didn't retaliate. She was lashing out because she was hurt, confused, and I was the one who'd put her in that position. I shifted slightly, lowering my head until it rested against my fists. We live our lives consumed by the little things, I said slowly, measuring my words. Waking up, brushing our teeth, going to work, paying bills, watching TV, dealing with the kids. It's an endless cycle, and we're so caught up in it that we don't stop to look at the bigger picture. We just keep moving, keep existing, without ever asking ourselves what it's all for. Her arms tightened around her chest as she leaned against the doorway. What does that have to do with leaving me? Leaving the boys? I looked up at her, my eyes meeting hers for the first time that night. Because tonight, I saw it. The bigger picture. I stepped back from all the noise, and for the first time, I truly saw our life. She stared at me, her lips parting slightly, as though she wanted to interrupt but didn't know how. Her silence felt like an invitation to continue, so I did. I saw who we are, who we were, and who we've become, I said, my voice soft but unyielding. And I realized something that I've been too afraid to admit to myself, let alone to you. Her body stiffened, her grip on herself tightening. And what's that? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That our marriage was a mistake. Her gasp was audible, and she took a step back as though the words had physically struck her. A mistake? She repeated, her voice shaking. How can you say that? After everything we've built, everything we've shared, how can you call it a mistake? I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself. This wasn't easy for me either. Because we love each other, Nora, I said finally. But we don't love each other the way a husband and wife should. Not anymore. She shook her head vehemently, tears glistening in her eyes. That's not true. I love you, Caleb. I've always loved you. I smiled sadly. You love me, but you're not in love with me. There's a difference, and we both know it. You've known it for years, just like I have. We've been holding on to the idea of what we should be, not what we actually are. Her tears spilled over, trailing down her cheeks. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice cracking. "This is about the party, isn't it? About Ryan? It was one stupid mistake, Caleb. One moment of bad judgment." I shook my head. "It's not about Ryan, Nora. It's not about the party. It's about everything that led us to that moment. It's about the silence that's grown between us. The intimacy that feels more like a routine than a connection. It's about the fact that I can feel you pulling away, even when you're right next to me." Her breath hitched as she tried to steady herself. "You're wrong," she whispered. "You're so wrong." "I wish I were," I said quietly. "Because I love you, Nora. I love you more than I've ever loved anyone. But love isn't enough to keep two people together when the rest of the pieces don't fit." Her hands fell to her sides, and she stared at me with a mix of disbelief and heartbreak. "You're giving up," she said finally. "You're giving up on us." I nodded slowly. "I'm giving us a chance to find something better. To stop pretending that this is enough when we both know it's not." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she looked truly defeated. "I don't understand," she murmured. "I know," I said softly. "But one day, you will." 3 hours ago, I was standing under the pavilion lights at the party, watching Nora from a distance. She was a vision in her white dress, the fabric flowing around her like water, clinging to her curves in all the ways that made men notice. And notice they did. I saw their lingering stares, their whispered remarks. I'd grown used to it over the years. Nora always drew attention wherever we went. But tonight, it wasn't the attention of strangers that gnawed at me. It was his. Ryan. Tall, broad-shouldered, and every bit the Southern charmer that I was not. He wasn't just any ex-boyfriend of hers. He was the one she always claimed was just a friend. The one who hovered too close at parties, who danced a little too intimately, who looked at her like she was still his. And tonight, he was here, weaving in and out of the crowd, always finding his way back to her. I watched as she laughed at something he said, her head tilted back, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. There was something in her laugh, something free and uninhibited that I hadn't seen in years. Not with me. She looked alive in a way that felt like a slap to the face. The music shifted to a slower tempo, and before I could process what was happening, Ryan extended his hand to her. She hesitated for a split second, a hesitation I would later cling to in my mind like a drowning man clutching a lifeline. But then she took it. He led her to the dance floor, his hand resting far too low on her back. I should have walked away. I should have turned my back on the scene unfolding before me. But I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the spot as I watched her sway in his arms. The way her body moved against his was intimate in a way that made my stomach churn. His hand slid down her back, his fingers grazing the curve of her hips. She pushed it away, but she didn't leave his arms. That was the part that cut the deepest. For a moment, I told myself it was nothing, just a dance, just an old friend enjoying the music. But then Ryan leaned in, his lips brushing her ear as he whispered something that made her smile. No, smirk. It wasn't the kind of smile you give your husband at the end of a long day. It was the kind you give a man who still has a hold on you. I couldn't take it anymore. I made my way through the crowd, each step fueled by a mix of anger and jealousy I hadn't felt in years. When I reached them, I forced a smile that I hoped looked natural, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "Ryan," I said, my voice calm but laced with an edge I couldn't hide. "Mind if I cut in?" Nora turned to me, her expression unreadable. There was no guilt, no embarrassment, just calm indifference. "Hey, baby," she said lazily. "It's just a dance. We were catching up. You don't mind, do you?" I looked at Ryan, whose smirk mirrored hers. His hand was still on her waist, and he didn't make any move to step away. "Yeah, Caleb," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Just a friendly dance. No harm in that, right?" His words hung in the air, daring me to react. I felt the weight of the crowd around us, their eyes flickering between the three of us like spectators waiting for the next act in a play. My jaw tightened as I turned to Nora. "This isn't a prom," I said, my voice low. "It's a party with your husband and 24 people who know both of us." Her eyes flashed with something I couldn't place. Defiance, maybe? "Caleb, stop," she said, her tone sharp. "You're making a scene. Ryan's just being his usual self. You don't have to—" Her words were cut off by Ryan, who chuckled and said, "Don't worry, Nora. I can handle your boy here." That did it. Before I could think better of it, I grabbed Ryan's wrist, yanking his hand off my wife. "Enough," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained anger. The crowd stilled, the music fading into the background as all eyes turned to us. Ryan's smirk widened as he leaned closer to me, his breath hot against my ear. "Careful, Professor," he whispered. "You wouldn't want to embarrass yourself." I stepped back, my fists clenched at my sides. Every part of me wanted to hit him, to wipe that smug expression off his face. But I knew I wouldn't win. Not here. Not like this. I turned to Nora one last time. "Enjoy your dance," I said quietly, my voice laced with bitterness. Then I walked away, leaving her and Ryan on the dance floor as the crowd murmured behind me. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, but my thoughts were loud, chaotic, and relentless. I replayed the scene at the party over and over again in my mind, dissecting every glance, every smirk, every touch that had passed between Nora and Ryan. I pulled into the driveway and killed the engine, but I didn't get out. The house loomed before me, dark and silent, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the party. It wasn't late, not by party standards, but the boys were at a friend's house, and there was no one waiting for me inside. For a moment, I considered turning the car back on and driving somewhere, anywhere, but I couldn't. Not yet. Finally, I forced myself out of the car and into the house. The familiar creak of the door as it opened felt strangely alien tonight, like I was stepping into someone else's life. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and stared at the room around me. The table where we ate dinner as a family. The fridge covered in the boys' drawings and photos from happier times. It all felt so distant, like it belonged to a story I'd read long ago. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, unscrewed the cap, and took a long sip. The cold liquid slid down my throat, momentarily dulling the ache in my chest. I sat at the table, staring at the grain of the wood as though it held answers I couldn't find anywhere else. What was I supposed to do? Confront her? Demand answers? I knew Nora would have an explanation ready, a way to make it all seem insignificant. "It was just a dance," she'd say. "Ryan's an old friend. You're overreacting." Maybe she'd even laugh it off, turning the blame back on me for being jealous. And maybe she'd be right. Maybe I was overreacting, or maybe I wasn't. I looked at the photo on the fridge. David catching his first football, his face lit up with pride. My throat tightened as I thought about our boys. What would this do to them? What kind of father would I be if I let my insecurities destroy their family? But this wasn't just about the boys. It was about us, me and Nora. The cracks in our marriage that had been growing for years, now threatening to split wide open. I'd ignored them for so long, convincing myself that love was enough to hold us together. But tonight, for the first time, I couldn't ignore them anymore. I took another sip of my beer and rested my head against the cool wood of the table. I let the weight of it all press down on me. The love I still felt for Nora, the anger at her carelessness, the ache of knowing she'd never looked at me the way she looked at Ryan tonight. I stayed there for what felt like hours, lost in thought. At some point, I realized the house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't just the absence of noise, but the presence of something heavier. Loneliness. Emptiness. I finished my beer and stood, my movements sluggish. Upstairs, in the bedroom we'd shared for 8 years, I found the suitcases from our last vacation. As I began packing, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't rage or despair. It was clarity. For the first time in years, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I packed methodically, each item finding its place in the suitcase like pieces of a puzzle. Trousers, shirts, jackets, toothbrush, razor, medications. The small, mundane details of leaving your life behind. When I finished, I stood in the doorway, looking back at the room. The bed we'd shared, the photos on the dresser, the closet half empty now. It all looked so ordinary, so painfully normal. But I knew I couldn't stay. Not anymore. I carried the suitcases downstairs and placed them by the door. Then I sat in the office, sinking into the chair and letting the darkness envelop me. I unscrewed another beer and stared at the faint glow of the streetlight outside. The house was silent again, but this time it felt like a different kind of silence, the kind that came before something irrevocable. I took a long sip, letting the weight of the decision settle over me. When Nora walked through that door, there would be no turning back. I didn't know what I'd say or how she'd react, but I knew one thing for certain. By the end of the night, nothing would ever be the same. The sound of the front door opening jolted me from my thoughts. I stayed seated in the dimly lit office, listening as Nora's heels clicked against the tile. She paused, longer than usual, and I knew she'd seen the suitcases. My pulse quickened, but I stayed still, waiting for her reaction. "Caleb?" she called out, her voice sharp, edged with confusion. The sound of her steps grew louder as she moved down the hallway. "What is this? What's going on?" I took a deep breath and leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. The shadows cloaked me like armor, giving me the illusion of strength I desperately needed. When she appeared in the doorway, her eyes locked on me. She didn't look angry, at least not yet. Mostly, she looked bewildered. "You're crazy," she said, her voice rising as she gestured toward the suitcases. "You're leaving? You're leaving me and our 2 boys because of one stupid mistake? Over Ryan?" I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to speak just yet. I wanted to stay calm, to avoid turning this into a shouting match. But the pain in her voice, it cut through me like a blade. She stepped into the room, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. "I didn't have an affair," she said, her tone defensive. "I didn't betray you, Caleb. I made a stupid mistake at a party, a drunken, stupid mistake. And now you're blowing it completely out of proportion." I raised my hand, signaling for her to stop. She froze mid-step, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read me. I saw her jaw tighten, her fingers gripping her arms a little harder. "What is this?" she demanded. "What's wrong with you? Why are you acting like this?" I shifted slightly in the chair, leaning back into the shadows. "I had a moment of clarity tonight," I said quietly. Her brow furrowed. "What does that even mean? A moment of clarity?" She shook her head in frustration. "Stop with the cryptic nonsense, Caleb. Just talk to me." I looked at her, really looked at her. The woman I'd loved for 8 years, the mother of my children. She was still so beautiful, standing there in her wrinkled dress, her dark hair slightly disheveled. But there was a distance between us now, a chasm I wasn't sure we could ever bridge. "I realized something tonight," I began, my voice steady but low. "Something I should have seen years ago." Her arms fell to her sides, her expression shifting from anger to unease. "What are you talking about?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Nora, this isn't about Ryan. It's not about the party. It's about us. It's about who we are and who we've become. She stared at me, her lips parting slightly as though she wanted to interrupt, but no words came out. I pressed on, my voice growing firmer. I saw our life tonight, the life we've built together, and for the first time, I truly understood that something is missing. Something has been missing for a long time. Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. Missing? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean, missing? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I love you, Nora. I always have. But love isn't enough to fix this. It isn't enough to make up for everything we've lost. She shook her head, taking another step closer. We haven't lost anything, she insisted. We're just going through a rough patch. Every marriage has rough patches, Caleb. That doesn't mean you throw everything away. Her words struck a nerve, and I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. She flinched slightly, startled by the sudden movement. This isn't a rough patch, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. This is years of silence, of pretending, of going through the motions, and I can't do it anymore. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked away as if trying to collect herself. So, what? She said after a moment, her voice trembling. You're just going to leave? Walk away from me, from the boys, from everything we've built? I took a step toward her, my voice softening. I'm not walking away from the boys. I'll always be there for them. But you and me, Nora, we're broken. And I don't think we can fix it. Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. You're giving up, she said finally, her voice barely audible. You're giving up on us. I hesitated, my chest tightening at the sight of her tears. No, I said quietly. I'm giving us both a chance to find something better, something real. She stared at me, her expression a mix of heartbreak and disbelief. You're making a mistake, Caleb, she whispered. A huge mistake. Maybe, I replied, my voice steady. But I've made plenty of those already. This time I need to do what feels right. For both of us. The silence between us was heavy, suffocating. She looked at me as though she didn't recognize the man standing before her. And in that moment, I wasn't sure I recognized myself either. The room was thick with tension, the kind of weight that pressed on your chest and made it hard to breathe. Nora stood across from me, her face pale, her hands trembling at her sides. The fire in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? Or guilt? I wasn't sure anymore. She finally broke the silence. You keep saying we're broken, Caleb, she said, her voice trembling. But you won't tell me why. You just keep blaming me, saying I don't love you, that I don't care about us. It's not fair. Fair? I echoed, a bitter laugh escaping before I could stop it. You want to talk about fair, Nora? Fine. Let's talk about fair. Was it fair when I stood there tonight watching you dance with Ryan? Watching his hands on you, his smug grin daring me to do something? Was it fair that I had to walk away because I knew if I didn't, I'd lose what little dignity I had left? Her eyes widened, and she took a step back, shaking her head. Caleb, that wasn't... Don't, I interrupted, my voice sharp. Don't tell me it wasn't what it looked like. Don't insult me like that. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For once, she didn't have an explanation, and the silence that followed was louder than any argument we could have had. I stepped closer, my gaze locked on hers. How long, Nora? I asked, my voice quieter now, but no less intense. How long have you been letting him come between us? Her face crumpled, and she turned away, crossing her arms over her chest. It's not like that, she said softly. Ryan and I... It's complicated. Complicated? I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. What's complicated about betraying your husband? She spun back to face me, her eyes flashing with anger. "I didn't betray you," she snapped. "Not like that. I've never slept with him. I swear, Caleb, I haven't." I studied her, searching for any sign that she was lying. Her eyes met mine, wide and earnest, and for a moment I wanted to believe her. I wanted to cling to the hope that, whatever else had happened, she hadn't crossed that final line. But then she looked away, and I saw it. The hesitation, the guilt. My stomach churned. "Maybe you didn't," I said, my voice tight. "But you wanted to, didn't you?" Her silence was answer enough. I stepped back, running a hand through my hair as I tried to steady myself. "God, Nora," I muttered. I knew things weren't perfect between us, but I never thought it was this bad. She took a tentative step toward me, her hands outstretched. "It's not what you think, Caleb," she pleaded. "Ryan, he's familiar. He's from a time in my life when things were simpler, easier. I don't know why I let myself get caught up in it, but it wasn't because I don't love you." I shook my head, letting out a hollow laugh. "You keep saying you love me, but your actions tell a different story. Do you even realize what you've done? Every time you let him get close, every time you let him touch you, you're not just hurting me, you're hurting us, our family, our boys." Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher. "I know," she whispered. "I know I've screwed up, but I didn't mean to. I never meant to hurt you, Caleb." I turned away, unable to look at her anymore. "Intent doesn't matter, Nora," I said quietly. "It's the result that counts, and the result is this. I don't trust you. Not anymore." Her sob caught in her throat, and for a moment, I thought she might collapse. But she stayed standing, her voice trembling as she asked, "So what now? Are you just going to leave? Throw everything away over something that didn't even happen?" I faced her again, my expression hard. "This isn't just about tonight," I said. "This is about every time you've put him above me, every time you've made me feel like I'm not enough. It's about years of feeling like a placeholder in my own marriage." Her lips quivered, and she reached for me, but I stepped back. "Caleb, please," she begged. "I know I've made mistakes, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy, talk to someone. Anything. Just don't give up on us." I stared at her, my chest tightening at the sight of her tears. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to take her in my arms and pretend that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. Not anymore. "I'm not giving up, Nora," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm letting go." Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, sobbing into her hands. I watched her for a moment, my heart breaking all over again, but I didn't move to comfort her. This was a wound that no amount of love could heal. The night air was sharp and cold, biting against my skin as I stood by the edge of the lake. The faint strains of southern rock still played from the pavilion, the party oblivious to what churned inside me. I stared out over the dark water, my reflection distorted and wavering like the life I was about to leave behind. I should have left right then, gotten in the car, driven home, and started packing. But something held me there, a tension in the air, or maybe just the weight of all I'd seen. And then I heard the footsteps. They were uneven, shuffling through the brush behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. I could feel his presence before I saw him. "Caleb," Ryan said, his voice slurred with the kind of confidence only alcohol could bring. "Didn't think you'd run off so quickly. What happened? Couldn't handle a little competition?" I clenched my fists at my sides, forcing myself to stay calm. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. "Not yet." He laughed, a low, mocking sound that grated against my nerves. "Man, you really are something," he said, stepping closer. "Always watching, never acting. Do you even know what you're doing here? Or is this just your way of pretending you're still in control? I turned slowly to face him, my gaze locking onto his. Even in the dim light, I could see the smug grin plastered across his face, the kind of grin that made my blood boil. "Go back to the party, Ryan," I said, my voice steady. "You've had your fun. It's over." He tilted his head, his grin widening. "Oh, it's over, is it? You think you can just walk away and leave me to pick up the pieces of your pathetic marriage? You think Nora's going to stay loyal to you after tonight?" The sound of her name on his lips was enough to break the fragile hold I had on my anger. Before I could stop myself, I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. "You don't know a damn thing about my marriage," I said through gritted teeth. Ryan laughed again, the sound cutting through the stillness of the night. "Oh, I know plenty," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "I know she's bored with you. I know she's been dreaming about me for years, even while she's lying next to you. And I know that no matter what you do, you'll never be enough for her." That was it, the line I couldn't let him cross. I swung before I even realized what I was doing, my fist connecting with his jaw with a sickening thud. The force of the punch sent him staggering back, his laughter replaced by a grunt of pain. For a moment, I thought it was over, that he'd back down, realize he'd gone too far. But Ryan wasn't that kind of man. He straightened, wiping a trickle of blood from the corner of his mouth, and smirked. "Finally," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I was starting to think you didn't have it in you." He lunged at me, his larger frame colliding with mine and sending us both tumbling to the ground. The breath was knocked out of me as I hit the dirt, his weight pressing down on my chest. His fist came down hard, catching me across the cheek, and I tasted blood. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I shoved him off with everything I had, rolling onto my knees and swinging wildly. My fist caught him in the stomach, and he doubled over, gasping for air. I didn't wait. I grabbed his shirt, pulling him to his feet and slamming him against a nearby tree. "You don't get to talk about her like that," I spat, my voice trembling with rage. "You don't get to touch her, to act like she's yours." Ryan coughed, his grin faltering as he struggled against my grip. "She'll always be mine," he rasped. "No matter what you do, Caleb, you'll always be second best." The words hit harder than any punch, but I didn't let go. I couldn't let him win. Not this time. I tightened my grip, my knuckles turning white as I held him against the tree. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it was over. The fight drained out of him, his body going limp in my grasp. I let go, stepping back and watching as he slumped to the ground, coughing and clutching his ribs. For a moment, I just stood there, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. My fists were raw, my face throbbing where he'd hit me, but I didn't feel the pain. All I felt was the weight of what I'd done, and the cold realization that it wouldn't change anything. Ryan looked up at me, his smirk replaced by something else. Fear. "You think this makes you a man?" he said, his voice hoarse. "You think this makes you better than me?" I didn't answer. I just turned and walked away, leaving him there in the dirt, his words following me like a shadow. I stood in the hallway, staring at the suitcases by the door. The air was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on both of us. Nora was sitting on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly together as if she could hold herself together through sheer willpower. Her tear-streaked face was pale, her lips trembling as she tried to form words that wouldn't come. "Nora," I began softly, breaking the silence. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. "Caleb, please," she whispered. "Don't do this." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "This isn't what I want," I said, my voice steady but heavy with emotion. "It's not about punishing you or running away. It's about facing the truth, even if it hurts." She stood abruptly, her hands reaching for me, but I stepped back, keeping the distance between us. "What truth?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "That you're giving up on us? On everything we've built? That's not you, Caleb. You don't just quit." I ran a hand through my hair, frustrated and heartbroken all at once. "I'm not quitting, Nora. I'm letting go. There's a difference." Her face crumpled, and she sank back onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. "I don't understand," she sobbed. "I don't understand how we got here." Neither did I. Not entirely. But I knew we couldn't stay here. Not in this limbo, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. I sat down in the armchair across from her, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. "I love you," I said quietly, "more than I've ever loved anyone. But love isn't enough to fix what's broken between us. We've been holding on to this idea of who we were, who we could be, but it's not real. It hasn't been real for a long time." She lifted her head, her tear-filled eyes searching mine. "Then let's make it real again," she pleaded. "We can try, Caleb. We can go to therapy, take a vacation, anything. Just don't give up on me. Don't give up on us." Her words cut through me like a knife, but I shook my head. "It's not that simple, Nora. Therapy won't fix the fact that you don't love me the way I love you. A vacation won't change the way we've grown apart." Her lip quivered, and she wiped at her tears with trembling hands. "You don't know that," she whispered. "You're just scared. You're scared of failing, scared of letting me in. But we can fix this, Caleb. I know we can." I leaned back, letting out a heavy sigh. "If we could, don't you think we would have by now? Don't you think we would have fought for it before it got to this point?" Her silence was deafening, the truth settling over us like a storm cloud. She knew, just as I did, that this wasn't something we could fix. Not anymore. I stood, walking over to the suitcases and picking them up. The weight of them felt lighter than the weight in my chest. Nora followed me to the door, her steps hesitant, as if she didn't want to get too close but couldn't bear to stay behind. "Caleb," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Please, don't go." I turned to her, setting the suitcases down and cupping her face in my hands. Her skin was warm and damp from her tears, her eyes filled with pain I couldn't take away. "I'll always love you," I said, my voice breaking. "But we both deserve more than this." I kissed her forehead, lingering for a moment before pulling away. Her hands clutched at my shirt, desperate to hold on, but I gently pried them away. "Goodbye, Nora," I whispered. And then I walked out the door, the sound of her sobs following me into the cold night. The night air was sharp, biting against my skin as I loaded the last of my belongings into the car. The street was quiet, save for the faint hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I stood by the open trunk, staring at the suitcases and laptop bag as if they held all the answers I couldn't find. I closed the trunk and leaned against the car, letting the cool metal ground me. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the photos of my boys. David catching his first football, Billy grinning with a missing tooth. My throat tightened as I thought about what this would mean for them, for our family. But I knew I couldn't stay. Not like this. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, the low rumble breaking the stillness. As I pulled away from the house, I glanced back one last time. The lights were still on, and I could see Nora's silhouette in the window, her figure blurred but unmistakable. My chest ached, but I forced myself to keep driving, focusing on the road ahead. The city lights blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I drove aimlessly for hours, letting the rhythm of the tires on the asphalt drown out my thoughts. By the time I found a cheap motel, the sky was starting to lighten, the first hints of dawn breaking through the darkness. I checked in, carrying my bags to the small, sterile room. The bed was unmade, the air stale, But it didn't matter. I dropped onto the mattress, staring at the ceiling as exhaustion finally took over. For the first time in years, I was alone. And for the first time, I felt free. The days that followed were a blur of logistics and heartache. I met with a lawyer, signed papers, and began searching for an apartment close enough to the boys' school that I could still be a part of their lives. Each step felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. Nora called, texted, begged for another chance. Her messages were a mix of anger, sorrow, and desperation. I wanted to respond, to explain, but I knew it would only make things harder for both of us. So I stayed silent. The hardest part was seeing the boys, their confusion, their sadness. It broke me in ways I hadn't anticipated. David asked why I wasn't coming home, why Mommy was always crying. Billy just clung to me, his small hands clutching my shirt like he was afraid I'd disappear. "I'm still here," I told them, holding them close. "I'll always be here for you." But I knew it wasn't enough. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't give them the family they deserved. I could only hope that one day they'd understand. As the weeks turned into months, I settled into my new reality. The apartment was small but comfortable, a space that felt like my own. I threw myself into work, into being the best father I could be. But there were nights, quiet, lonely nights, when I thought about Nora, about the life we'd built and the pieces we couldn't put back together. I loved her, I always would, but some wounds ran too deep to heal.